I thought burying my son would be the hardest thing I'd ever do. After 3 years of watching cancer steal him piece by piece, after holding his hand through every treatment, after saying goodbye in a sterile hospital room that smelled of disinfectant and broken dreams, I believed I had faced the worst grief could offer. But as I stood beside his casket, watching the last hymn fade into silence, she walked in. Isabella Reeves, the woman who had abandoned him 15 years ago, who had vanished when the medical bills mounted and hope seemed lost, who had never once called during his final months, stepped through those chapel doors in 4-inch heels and a sharp black dress, looked at a room full of mourners, and announced she was there to claim the $24 million my son left behind. That's when I learned that some betrayals cut deeper than death itself, and some battles begin precisely when you think the war is over. I'll tell you everything. First, let me thank you for watching Granny's Voice. Please subscribe and tell us where you're watching from in the comments. We might give you a shout out in our next video. Today's special shout out goes to Nadira Brown from Amherst, New York. Thank you for being part of our family. Now let me tell you everything. At my son's funeral, when the flowers had not even wilted, his ex-wife, who abandoned him 15 years ago, walked in and claimed the $24 million he left behind as if it belonged to her. My chest tightened. The whispers around me cut deeper than the coffin lowering into the ground. I stood there, torn between grief and fury, realizing this betrayal was not just against me, but against my son's memory. What followed would tear apart every mask in that room and leave no place to hide. At my son's funeral, when the flowers were still fresh and his favorite hymn had barely finished echoing through the church, she walked in. Isabella Reeves, the woman who left him 15 years ago without a single word of goodbye, without a dime of support, without attending a single hospital visit when he was sick. She stepped through the chapel doors in 4-inch heels, a sharp black dress, and a smirk that froze the entire room. Then she spoke loudly, clearly, like she had rehearsed it. I am here to claim what belongs to me, the $24 million estate my husband left behind. As his lawful wife, I have every legal right to it. I could feel the air get sucked from the room. Some people gasped, others turned to each other, stunned. But me. I just stared at the coffin. My son's name was carved into the brass plate, shining in the soft candle light. David Chin. He hadn't even been in the ground 10 minutes, and she was already clawing at what was left of him. It wasn't sadness that hit me. Not at that moment. It was heat rising in my chest, tightening in my neck, a quiet fury that sat heavy behind my ribs. I didn't turn to look at her. Not yet. I kept my eyes on the casket and pressed my palm flat against the fabric of my dress to stop it from shaking. My late husband used to say I had the patience of a stone wall. That day I needed it. Isabella's lawyer stood next to her, young and nervous, flipping through some papers in a blue folder. Anthony Brooks. I could hear his voice tremble as he mentioned marital status, survivor rights, and some clause in a policy he hadn't read carefully enough. He didn't even know she had signed away every right she had in their divorce settlement all those years ago. I looked to my left. Eleanor Walsh, my lawyer and the only other person who had known what was coming, gave me a small nod. She was already pulling a folder from her bag. Not the time yet. Just wait. Across the aisle, the whispers had begun. Isabella's entrance hadn't just shattered the silence. It had shattered the illusion of peace. Mourners shifted uncomfortably in their pews. Some looked down. Others stared at me, waiting, as if I would fall apart, as if I would break. But I didn't. I slowly turned to face her. She didn't flinch. Her eyes met mine with the cold confidence of a woman who thought she had won. She raised her chin, clearly proud of herself. Maybe she expected me to cry, to beg, to argue right there in front of the altar, but I didn't move. And maybe that rattled her because her voice grew louder. I am not here to fight. I am here to collect what is legally mine. I finally spoke, my voice calm, colder than hers. You are not his wife. Not anymore. For a second she hesitated. Anthony whispered something, flipping a page, but I could see it in her face. She had hoped I didn't know the law. She had hoped I would be too distraught to react. She thought this funeral was her stage and that I would be too broken to push back. Then Eleanor stepped forward, silent as a shadow, and handed the church's officiant a copy of the divorce decree. Stamped, sealed, notarized. Full waiver of future claim to assets finalized over a decade ago. I didn't need to say anything else. The truth was in ink, and the hush that followed was louder than any shouting could have been. Someone coughed. Someone else muttered, "Lord, help us." Isabella stood still, lips tight, eyes darting across the pews. She was waiting for someone to speak up for her. No one did. And I stood there, not triumphant, not smug, just steady. I had spent 15 years raising my son alone after she left him with nothing but medical debt and heartbreak. I had been there for every radiation appointment, every surgery, every late-night call when the pain came faster than the meds could keep up. She had been gone, vanished until the money made it worth coming back. So when I finally turned to leave the chapel, I didn't look back at her. I walked toward the exit with Eleanor beside me, our steps slow and even. I heard someone whisper my name with sympathy. Another said, "Justice." But I didn't need sympathy. I didn't want justice. Not yet. Because I knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. And if you think that was the end of it, you might want to stay with me. The next few hours, they were only the beginning. And what came next made the funeral look like a warm-up. We didn't leave the chapel in silence. Behind me, I could hear murmurs swelling into low conversations, chairs shifting, the creak of wooden pews as people stood to follow. Isabella's voice, sharp and trembling now, followed me out the door like the echo of something broken. But I didn't slow down. Outside, the wind had picked up. Eleanor caught up with me at the edge of the stone steps and handed me a manila envelope without a word. I tucked it under my arm. We both knew it would be needed soon. Robert Hayes, the funeral director, flustered, met us at the curb to apologize for the disruption. I told him not to worry. Death doesn't always bring dignity. He didn't know what to say after that, and I didn't need him to. We got in the car. Eleanor drove. I sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window, hands folded, breathing slow, not calm, just controlled. There's a difference. Took exactly 11 minutes to get to the downtown office of Walsh & Associates. Jennifer Lee, Eleanor's assistant, had already cleared the conference room. She slid the door closed behind us and locked it. Then Eleanor placed 2 documents on the table and smoothed them out. The first was the updated last will and testament of my son, dated 9 months before he passed. I had sat beside him when he signed it. His hands thin but steady. In it he left every asset he had to me, the money, the company stock, the property, the insurance payout, even the intellectual rights to the app he had designed in the final months of his life. There was no mention of Isabella, not a single line. The second document was the divorce settlement from 15 years ago. A full waiver of future rights to any assets current or forthcoming, finalized and notarized. Eleanor had the certified copy in hand along with the county filing record. No loopholes, no ambiguity. Still, Eleanor's voice was measured. Isabella has nothing to stand on, but she's bold. I expect she will escalate. He nodded. My jaw was clenched, not in fear, but in focus. If Isabella wanted to turn this into a war, I would meet her at the front lines. I had mourned my son with every part of me. Now I would defend what he left behind. I would not let a woman who vanished for 15 years twist the final chapter of his life into a legal circus. Eleanor handed me a copy of the estate inventory, neatly listed in categories. I glanced through it. Bank holdings, company shares, the lake house, the condo, even the car. Then I saw the last item, a private video letter recorded by my son and stored digitally under attorney-client protection. I hadn't known he had done that. Eleanor tapped the folder. It's time. We drove to the courthouse, not for a hearing, not yet, but for a meeting Eleanor had arranged with Judge Patricia Morrison on emergency probate procedures. A courtesy given the size of the estate and the obvious tension surrounding it. She agreed to review the files early and confirm that Isabella's claims would be flagged as invalid upon immediate filing. A temporary protection order over the estate was issued within the hour. Back outside, the sky had darkened, clouds folding in like a curtain drawn before a storm. Anthony Brooks called Eleanor while we were on the steps. Eleanor answered on speaker. His voice cracked as he asked for a meeting to discuss possible joint resolution. Eleanor replied that all conversations needed to be in writing, and that Isabella's interference at a religious service would be included in any formal response. I didn't speak during the call. I didn't need to. I had spent years being silent for the sake of peace, for my son, for family. That time had ended the moment Isabella said, $24 million, in front of his coffin. That evening back home, I opened the private video letter. He was sitting in the chair by the window, the one we used to read next to when he was a boy. His voice was calm, his tone clear. He spoke about the foundation he wanted me to build, the community scholarships, the memorial garden behind the tech lab. He spoke about me, about the way I had stood by him, about the strength he hoped I would keep showing even after he was gone. Then near the end, he said something I will never forget. If she comes back, I need you to stand your ground. Not just for me, for yourself. She walked away from me. But you, Mom, you never did. You deserve everything I left you. I chose you. I played that last part twice, and then I sat in silence with the weight of those words on my chest like a hand pressing firmly but gently. I didn't cry. Not that night. There would be time for that later. Right now I had a decision to make. I opened my desk drawer and pulled out a notepad. I wrote down 3 names. 3 people who had stood by my son when Isabella didn't. 3 people who had witnessed things, known things. One of them had access to hospital records. Another had archived the development contracts. The third had personal emails that were never released. This wasn't about revenge. It was about protection. I would not let her rewrite his story. Not while I had breath in my lungs. Not while I still had his voice in my ears. It had begun at the funeral, but by morning this would become something else entirely. By the next morning word had spread. Not about the money, that would come later, but about what happened in the church, about Isabella's entrance, about the confrontation, about the silence that followed. My phone rang before sunrise. Old neighbors, distant cousins, people I hadn't heard from in years calling to ask how I was holding up. But underneath the concern, I could hear something else. Curiosity, hesitation, a faint questioning tone in their voice, like they weren't sure what side of the story they believed yet. I didn't return the calls. I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of black coffee and watched the sky lighten over the backyard. The same yard where my son had played when he was small, where we had grilled burgers on weekends, where I had planted forget-me-nots along the fence line during his first round of chemotherapy. It was a quiet space, a good place to think. But the quiet didn't last. Around 10 that morning, Isabella posted a photo, a cropped picture of my son from years ago, one she had no business sharing. Her caption was short. Heartbroken to say goodbye to the love of my life. May justice be served. Then came the comments. Most were from people who didn't know better or didn't care to. People who took her version of the story and ran with it. There were sympathy emojis. Words like brave and unfair and tragic. A few mentioned lawyers. One said she should fight for what was hers. That was the moment it changed. I had already expected a legal fight. I had already secured the documents. But this was something different. This was public. This was image. And if I had learned anything over the past decade, it was that people believe what they see first, even if it's a lie. I texted Eleanor. Her reply came fast. Already monitoring. We're preparing a timeline for release. Within the hour, Sophia Martinez, my son's CFO, called to say she had received 2 calls from journalists asking about the widow. Sophia said that word with a tight bitterness I appreciated. I told her to sit tight. We weren't going to react. We were going to respond. And there's a difference. At noon, I drove downtown to meet Eleanor. She had booked a quiet room in a private library that used to be a bank. Thick walls, soundproof. We didn't want ears. What we had to prepare wasn't just legal anymore. It was reputational. Eleanor laid out the plan. 3 parts. First, confirm the legal standing with Judge Morrison's temporary order, and begin process for a permanent motion to block Isabella's interference. That part was already in motion. Second, gather all personal evidence my son left behind and all documentation from people in his inner circle. Sophia had emails and schedules. James Thompson had notarized records of the divorce and property settlements. Marcus Rivera, the ICU nurse, had a written statement about the final week, including the visit Isabella never made. Third, prepare for the event. That was the part Eleanor hadn't told me yet. She wanted to hold a public dedication, not just a press release or a legal filing, but something real, something visible, a public commitment to the foundation my son had wanted to create. Eleanor believed that the best defense wasn't just a courtroom. It was a crowd. And she wasn't wrong. We chose a date 3 days from now. Location, the main conference room at City Hall. Mayor Thomas Sterling had already expressed support for the foundation months earlier when my son was still alive and quietly laying the groundwork. We still had the letters, the permits, everything he had arranged. We were simply continuing what he started. But I wasn't interested in staging a spectacle. I told Eleanor this had to remain centered on him. Not her, not me, the cause, the mission, the community impact. That's what mattered. Still, I knew Isabella would come, and I needed to be ready. That evening, I visited the old tech office where my son used to work. The lights were dimmed now, the furniture covered. The staff had moved on after the acquisition, but Sophia still had the keys. She met me at the front and walked me to his old desk. His chair was still there. So was the mug with the chip on the handle. The whiteboard with half-faded notes about app functionality. His handwriting. Sophia handed me a flash drive. She didn't say much, just pressed it into my palm and nodded. Inside were the last 2 months of my son's private emails. She had filtered out anything irrelevant. What remained were communications about the foundation, his final medical instructions, and his last known contacts with legal advisors. Later that night I sat at my own desk, the same one where I used to grade papers when I taught 2nd grade, and I opened the drive. There were 3 emails flagged with red stars. 1 to Eleanor, 1 to Sophia, 1 to me. The one to me was never sent. He had saved it as a draft. It said, "Mom, if you're reading this, I'm gone. And if she shows up, I know it'll be hard. But I need you to remember. You are the only one who stayed. You were there when I couldn't walk. When I couldn't sleep, when I was more tubes than skin. You never once left the room. So don't let her rewrite what you and I both lived. I chose you, not her, never her." That was the moment my doubt vanished. Not that I had planned to step aside, but something inside me settled. I had carried pain and fury all week. Now I had clarity. She wanted to weaponize public opinion. I would hold up the truth, not just in court, but in front of every person who had seen her post and believed her lie. In 3 days I would stand in that room and the story would be his. Not hers, not mine. His all the way through. 3 days after the funeral, I walked into City Hall through the back entrance. Eleanor had arranged it that way. Less noise, fewer eyes. The auditorium was already filling with people. Local press, tech investors, community leaders. Mayor Sterling's office had confirmed attendance, not to make a speech, but to show support. That mattered more. The event was simple on paper. A dedication, the public launch of the David Chen Memorial Foundation. But we all knew it was more than that. It was a message. The chairs were arranged in rows facing a projection screen. A banner hung near the front. A legacy of purpose. My son's face was on the program, smiling in that quiet way he always had when he was proud but didn't want attention. That smile would speak for him now. Eleanor and Sophia handled the press check-in. James was stationed by the side table with legal binders. Marcus, the nurse, had volunteered to help escort elderly guests. Everyone had a role. Everyone understood the stakes. At 10:02 a.m., the doors closed. At 10:05, Eleanor stepped up to the podium and tapped the mic once. She didn't smile. She wasn't here to charm anyone. "Good morning. We are here to honor the vision and values of a man who lived with quiet brilliance and left behind a plan for impact. What you will see today is not about loss. It is about intention, about clarity, about truth. She stepped aside and the lights dimmed. The screen lit up with a video. It was dated 5 weeks before his death. My son sat in a chair, shoulders a bit slouched, eyes tired but focused. The background was his home office, the one filled with books and plants and pictures I knew by heart. His voice came through steady. "If you are watching this, then I'm not around anymore." But I wanted to explain in my own words why I made the choices I did. I didn't want confusion. I didn't want arguments. I wanted the truth to speak for itself. He went on to describe his illness, his hopes for the foundation, his decision to leave his assets to me and only me, his reasons. Not emotional, not vengeful, just measured. "She left," he said plainly. "When I needed her most, she was gone. And when I built something worth returning for, she came back. I cannot allow that to define my legacy. I am choosing the person who never left." The room was silent when the video ended. No coughing, no fidgeting, just stillness. I stood not because I wanted to, because I had to. I walked slowly to the podium. I had spoken in classrooms for 30 years. I had given eulogies and birthday toasts and retirement speeches. But this moment was different. This was not about celebration. This was about line drawing. I thanked everyone for being there. I acknowledged Mayor Sterling's presence. Then I read the names of the first scholarship recipients. I read the names of local schools receiving STEM grants. I outlined the emergency medical relief fund that would carry my son's name. The audience listened closely. No one interrupted. Then I addressed the situation directly. Some of you may have seen posts online, heard rumors, read comments. I will not respond to gossip. I will respond with evidence. Sophia dimmed the lights again. The screen showed emails from my son, labeled, dated, verified communications with Eleanor, with Sophia, with me. They documented his intentions, his revised estate plans, his cancelled insurance beneficiary designations, everything. The foundation of facts. Next came scanned legal documents. The divorce decree, the settlement agreement, the waiver of rights. Highlighted in yellow, the line where Isabella had signed her full consent to relinquish any future claims. Then the last slide. A screenshot of an email Isabella had sent to a close friend 6 weeks before the funeral. The message had been forwarded anonymously to Eleanor's office. In it, Isabella wrote, "I don't care what it takes. I'm going back to get what should have been mine. He owed me. And if his mother wants a war, I'm ready." I looked at the audience. That was her story. This is mine. And this foundation, this work, this legacy belongs to the man who earned it. Not the one who left him. Not the one who came back when the headlines did. A few people clapped, then a few more. By the time I stepped back from the podium, it was a full room of applause. I didn't smile. I didn't bow. I just nodded once and returned to my seat. Isabella was there. I had seen her arrive late. She sat in the back row, sunglasses on, lips tight. When the lights came back on, she stood and left. She didn't make a scene. She didn't speak. But her heels clicked loud against the floor as she exited, like she wanted to be heard, like she wanted someone to chase her. No one did. Eleanor leaned toward me. "She's going to retaliate." I didn't reply. I didn't need to. She would try and we would be ready. After the event ended, people came up to me, shook my hand, told me stories about my son, stories I hadn't heard before. A classmate from college, a mentee from a tech incubator, a father whose child had received free tutoring from the app my son had built in his final year. That afternoon, a photo from the event hit the news. Me standing at the podium, one hand on the lectern, the other holding the program. My son's face beside me on the screen. The caption read, "A mother protects her son's legacy." And that's exactly what I had done. Publicly, clearly, without shouting, without rage, but with every fact sharpened like a blade. It wasn't revenge. Not yet. But it was the beginning. The next morning I woke to silence. No new texts, no missed calls, no emails from Eleanor. But I didn't mistake the stillness for peace. It was the kind of silence that comes before something breaks. At 8:30, Eleanor sent me a single message. "Stay off social media." Her tone was always controlled, but I could feel the urgency behind those 4 words. I obeyed, but I didn't have to wonder long. Sophia called 30 minutes later. She didn't waste time. "Isabella posted something. Video clip. Spliced edits of your son out of context. Makes it sound like he regretted changing the will." She added her own voice over. I closed my eyes and took a long breath. The event at City Hall had shaken her. Now she was fighting dirty. That afternoon, Eleanor and I met again in the same private room at the old bank building. She had already downloaded the clip, backed it up, transcribed it, and had a team verifying its edits. There was no full footage to match, no record of those words in any raw files. It was fabrication, but it was subtle enough to fool people who wanted to believe her. Eleanor turned the laptop screen toward me and pressed play. My son's voice came through, but the sentences were clipped, phrases rearranged, pauses removed. He sounded unsure, weighed down. Then Isabella's voice layered in. She spoke gently, sympathetically, but every word implied that I had manipulated my son into excluding her. She had even titled the video, "Let the Truth Be Heard." It was already being shared. Comments turned fast. Strangers called her brave. Others called me greedy. A few suggested I had isolated my son during his illness, pushed away his friends, cut off his former wife out of jealousy. Lies grow fast in the right soil. But we didn't panic. Eleanor already had the next move planned. The first part was simple. We would release the full video in question, the untouched version, time-stamped, recorded in a single take. James had the original on a secure drive. The second part took more coordination. By evening, Sophia had secured permission from 3 of my son's former business partners to share internal communications, archived emails, meeting notes, messages from my son expressing disappointment in Isabella's behavior. In one message dated 2 years before his death, he wrote, "She reached out again, not to ask about my health, not to apologize, just to find out if the IPO went through. I'm tired of pretending people care when they don't. I don't have the energy anymore." Eleanor gathered these into a packet labeled Behavioral Pattern Documentation. Clean, professional, devastating. The next morning we held a press briefing. Not a flashy one, no podium, just a conference room with a projector and printed packets for every person in the room. Eleanor opened with a single sentence. "Misinformation is dangerous. Here is the truth." Then we played the full original video. My son's unedited message. Calm, clear, confident. He explained his decisions without hesitation, without confusion. He named me as his sole executive, his only caregiver, his only remaining family. We distributed the written evidence. We allowed time for questions. We gave no sound bites, no spin, just facts. Isabella didn't respond publicly, but she didn't need to. The damage was already visible. That night, one of the community blogs that had praised her earlier issued a quiet retraction. Another pulled down her video. A third posted side-by-side transcripts showing how the clip had been manipulated. Still, it wasn't enough. Not for me. The facts were on my side. But I wasn't chasing facts. I was chasing clarity. So I made a decision. I called Sophia and asked her to release the internal memo my son had written during his final hospital stay. It had been meant for the company's board, but it was personal in tone. It detailed his plan for the foundation, his reasons for creating it in my name, his desire to distance the organization from anyone who had abandoned him. At the end of the memo he wrote, "I don't want my name used for anything fake, anything shallow. If people are going to remember me, let it be for what I actually did and who actually stood by me." Eleanor hesitated before agreeing. It was a powerful piece. It would land hard, but it would also stir things up again. I told her that was the point. It went live at noon, published with consent from the board and endorsed by the foundation. It didn't attack Isabella. It didn't mention her by name, but it exposed every lie she had told just by existing. By evening I began receiving messages. Strangers, survivors, caregivers, people who had watched loved ones die slowly and alone. They wrote to say they understood. They believed me. They had seen people show up too late just to claim something they hadn't earned. But even that didn't satisfy me. Not fully, because Isabella wasn't done. At 10:30 that night, Eleanor called me again. She's filed a motion to contest the will. Claims your son was coerced. Claims he lacked full mental capacity when he made the final changes. I asked Eleanor how strong the claim was. She said weak, but it would force a response. It would trigger discovery. It would open records. I told her I wasn't afraid of records. Let her dig. Because the deeper she went, the more she would uncover the truth she was trying to bury. This wasn't just about a lie anymore. This was about character. And character has a longer reach than money. She wanted war. I had warned her. And now she had it, on paper, on record, in front of everyone. The filing came in late on a Thursday. Eleanor forwarded me the motion at 9:42 p.m., exactly the way I knew she would. Clean, annotated, with a short note at the bottom. You do not need to respond yet. But you should see this. I read every page. Isabella's legal team had accused me of undue influence. They claimed my son had been emotionally manipulated, that I had isolated him, that I had coerced him into rewriting the will when his mind was clouded by medication and illness. They called me controlling, overbearing, ruthless. I sat alone at the kitchen table, the same table where I used to lay out science projects and spelling flashcards, the same table where I had once shaved my son's head after his first round of chemo, trying to make him laugh as the hair came out in clumps. Now that table held an accusation that I had stolen from him, bent him to my will, used his pain to my benefit. I let myself feel it. Not the anger, not yet. The grief. It settled in my chest like something old returning. Something with weight. Something I thought I had already made peace with. But it came back that night because to read that motion was to relive every hour I had sat beside him. Every time I had held a vomit bag in one hand and his fingers in the other. Every time I had pressed the morphine button when the nurse didn't come fast enough. They called me ruthless. But they weren't there when I read to him through the nausea. When I changed his sheets at 3 o'clock in the morning. When I massaged his feet so he could sleep. They weren't there the night he woke up screaming and couldn't remember what year it was. They weren't there the afternoon he asked me clearly and with full breath to make sure she never got a penny. So I let the weight sit. I didn't fight it. I didn't push it away. I poured myself a glass of water. I sat still. I let the words wash over me. And I remembered exactly who I was. Not the woman they described on paper, but the mother who stayed. The next morning I met Eleanor at her office. She had already drafted our initial response. But before we filed anything, we sat in silence for a while. She looked at me like she was waiting for me to crack or to rage or to break down. I didn't. I just said, let's make it clean. Let's make it final. She nodded. We agreed to prepare the affidavit. Marcus's testimony as the nurse, Sophia's statement as CFO, James's notarized logs. We would include the full email chain that documented my son's requests, his voice recording, his private memo, everything. But I didn't want the next step to be only legal. I needed something more. I told Eleanor I wanted to write a letter, not for court, for the foundation, for the community. She hesitated but agreed. That weekend I sat down with a pen and wrote in longhand. I kept it simple. I am not my son's voice. But I am the echo of what he believed. He believed in fairness, in decency, in truth that did not need to shout to be heard. He built what he built not for fame or legacy but because he wanted to solve a problem, to leave something useful behind. I stayed by his side. I did not do it for reward. I did not do it for recognition. I did it because I loved him and because I believe in what he wanted this foundation to be. The next week, Eleanor filed the full rebuttal. It was longer than the original motion, more thorough, heavier with documentation. Then we waited. During that time, Isabella did what I expected. She went to the press, gave interviews, played the role. She spoke about love and memory and heartbreak. She shared carefully cropped photos. She cried on cue. But something had shifted. The public wasn't so sure anymore. Some articles began using the word alleged. Some commenters began referencing the full video, the emails, the contradiction between what she said and what the documents showed. Truth doesn't always move fast, but it moves steady. Eleanor told me it could take weeks for Judge Morrison to review the motion. She warned me that Isabella might push for a hearing, might try to delay things, might try to drain us with time. I told her I wasn't worried because I had already waited through worse. I had waited through blood tests and scan results and the sound of machines beeping in the middle of the night. Waiting for court dates and paper reviews didn't scare me. Not like watching your child fade by inches. During those days I stayed busy. I spent mornings at the foundation office reviewing grant proposals, meeting with Dr. Linda Park, the new director, setting up scholarship panels with Michael Foster and Sarah Kim. I made sure the work moved forward. I kept my hands busy so my heart would not stay clenched. One afternoon, while I was reviewing budget reports, Betty Williams, a volunteer, walked in with a letter. It was handwritten. No return address. Inside was a simple message. You are not alone. Believe you. I watched my sister get taken apart by someone like her. Thank you for speaking up. There was no signature, just those few lines. But it reminded me that what we were doing was not only about property or inheritance. It was about setting the story right. Not with fire but with focus, not with volume but with proof. That was what she never understood. She thought power came from noise. But I had learned that power, real power, comes from consistency. And I would be consistent all the way through. The ruling came on a Wednesday morning. It was quiet, not televised, no camera crews, no headlines screaming justice or fraud, just a notification from Eleanor that the court had issued its decision. She had forwarded the official copy to my inbox. 212 pages. I read every one. The motion to contest the will was dismissed in full. No trial, no hearing. Judge Morrison had found the evidence clear. My son had been of sound mind. He had made his decisions deliberately. There was no sign of coercion, no manipulation, no external pressure. Isabella's claims were described as unfounded, speculative, and in several instances, intentionally misleading. That last phrase mattered most. Intentionally misleading. In court language, that meant more than just losing. It meant exposure. It meant vulnerability. It meant consequences. The next step moved faster than even Eleanor expected. Within 48 hours, the court ordered a hearing to review potential sanctions against Isabella's legal team. Misuse of process, abuse of system, attempting to mislead a probate court with altered materials. The hearing was scheduled for the following week. I didn't plan to attend at first. I had told myself the dismissal was enough, that I didn't need to see the fallout, that I had what I came for. My son's wishes protected, his legacy intact. But 2 days before the hearing, Eleanor called. She said Isabella had submitted a last-minute request. She wanted the hearing closed to the public, claimed emotional distress, claimed it would harm her reputation, claimed it would interfere with her ability to seek work and rebuild her life. Judge Morrison denied her request. That's when I decided I would be there. I arrived early, sat in the back row. The room was small, no media, just the parties, their lawyers, and a few court staff. Eleanor sat beside me, her posture relaxed but alert. Isabella entered 5 minutes before the start, dressed in a navy suit that was too polished for the setting. Her hair was pulled back. Her eyes didn't scan the room. She knew I was there, but she didn't look at me. Judge Morrison entered. The hearing began. No drama, no theatrics, just a slow, methodical breakdown of what had happened. They reviewed the motion Isabella had filed, the video she had posted, the way it had been edited, the affidavit that contradicted her version of events, the financial records, the legal history, her pattern of communication with people close to my son, the timing of her appearance, her social media statements before and after the funeral. They pulled it all apart piece by piece, thread by thread. And when they were done, it was bare. No support, no defense, no ground left to stand on. Anthony Brooks attempted to argue that she had been misled, that she hadn't fully understood the risks, that she had acted out of grief. But Judge Morrison stopped him. The grief of losing a man you abandoned does not excuse the manipulation of this court. His words, not Eleanor's, not mine. Judge Morrison then turned his attention to Anthony's conduct. He asked about the origin of the edited video, about the decision to file the motion without disclosing the full estate documentation, about the statements made to the media that implied there was a pending investigation into me. No answers satisfied him. By the end of the hearing, it was clear sanctions were recommended. Anthony would face formal review from the state bar. Isabella herself would be required to pay legal fees associated with the response to her motion. The amount was steep. The court issued a freeze on her accounts pending collection. It wasn't jail. It wasn't scandal, but it was the legal version of a reckoning. I watched her face as Judge Morrison read the decision aloud. Her expression didn't change, not once. But her hands moved, tightening, untightening, one after the other. When the judge adjourned the hearing, Eleanor and I stood. We didn't approach. We didn't linger. But as we walked toward the exit, Isabella turned just slightly. Not enough to make eye contact, but enough for me to see the hollow look in her eyes. She had walked into this thinking she could bend reality. She left with her name in court records, her finances locked, her story shredded. That afternoon, Eleanor sent out a statement to the Foundation's press contacts. Brief, professional. The David Chan Memorial Foundation respects the court's findings and remains committed to carrying forward the mission defined by its founder. We consider this matter resolved. No triumph, no spike in tone, just finality. I sat in my garden that evening alone. The same bench where my son once sat after his first clean scan, and I breathed in the quiet. Not peace, not yet, but quiet. The kind that comes after a door has been shut, the kind that says you made it through something and nothing needs to be said anymore. The following week I received a letter. Handwritten, no return address, just my name on the front. No one sends handwritten letters anymore. But I knew before I opened it who it was from. It wasn't a confession or an apology. It wasn't even a threat. It was a request. One line. I need 5 minutes just to say one thing in person. I set the letter aside, let it sit on my nightstand for 2 days. I didn't show it to Eleanor. I didn't call anyone. And then one afternoon, I called the number she scribbled at the bottom. I told her to meet me at the public greenhouse on Sycamore Street. Midday, neutral ground, no cameras, no eyes. When I arrived, she was already there, sitting at a bench near the orchid section. That felt almost deliberate. Orchids don't beg for attention. They sit quietly and command it. I approached slowly, sat down beside her. There was space between us. Not a word passed between us for nearly a full minute. Then she spoke, not with an apology, not even a soft tone. Her voice was clipped, measured, but not cold. She said she was angry. Angry that she had been written out of her own history, that the world remembered her only as the woman who left, that my son had moved on without her and found meaning elsewhere. She said she had thought that maybe, just maybe, she could reclaim a piece of that story by stepping back in when he was gone. Not for money, she said, but for relevance, for image, for the right to not be forgotten. I didn't interrupt. I let her speak. Then I looked at her and I told her the truth. That being forgotten was not a punishment. It was a consequence. You disappear from people's lives when you choose to disappear from their pain. My son had spent the better part of a decade healing from what she left him with. His dignity wasn't a prize. It was earned with grit, with nights full of silence, with friendships forged from scratch, with a kind of quiet strength that never made the papers. I reminded her that legacy isn't built through drama. It's built through presence, through staying, through showing up when there is nothing to gain. She looked away. Her jaw was tight. Her fingers clenched the edge of the bench. Then she said she had no plan left, that the court orders had wiped out what little she had, that she wasn't here to ask for help, but she didn't know what came next. I believed her, not because I trusted her, but because desperation has a sound, and I had lived through enough to recognize it. I didn't offer her comfort, But I didn't add cruelty either. I stood, told her to take care of herself, told her this would be the last time we spoke, that if she ever approached the foundation, the board, or my family again, I would respond with the full force of law. Her mouth opened slightly like she wanted to protest, but she didn't. She just nodded once, slow and almost imperceptible. I walked away and didn't look back. 6 months later, the David Chen Memorial Foundation had awarded its first round of scholarships. 12 students from underserved communities received full funding for STEM programs. The Emergency Medical Relief Fund had helped 17 families navigate treatment costs during critical illness. The memorial garden behind the tech lab was in its planning phase, designed by the same landscape architect who had worked on the city's botanical center. Frank Rodriguez, one of our volunteers, sent me photos from the scholarship ceremony. Young faces, bright with possibility, holding certificates that bore my son's name. In the background, I could see the banner we had hung at that first City Hall event. A legacy of purpose. I kept one of those photos on my desk, next to the last picture I had taken of David. He was sitting in his wheelchair on the back porch, thin but smiling, his laptop open as he worked on the app's final updates. The sun was behind him, casting light through his hair in a way that made him look almost translucent, like he was already becoming something else, something larger than his failing body. That's how I choose to remember him. Not as the victim in Isabella's fabricated story, not as the prize in a legal battle, but as the quiet innovator who spent his final months designing tools to help other cancer patients track their symptoms and connect with support networks. As the man who, even when morphine clouded his thoughts, never forgot to ask how I was holding up. Eleanor called me last Tuesday with an update I hadn't expected. Isabella had moved out of state, apparently taken a job with a small marketing firm in Oregon. No fanfare, no announcement, just gone. Eleanor had only found out because her address change had triggered a notification in the court system, something about monitoring requirements related to the financial judgment. I felt nothing when I heard the news. Not relief, not satisfaction, not sadness. Just a kind of closure, like the final page of a difficult chapter had finally turned. The foundation continues its work. Dr. Linda Park has proven to be an exceptional director, expanding our reach beyond what David had originally envisioned. Last month, we partnered with 3 major hospitals to pilot the medication tracking app he had designed. The beta testing showed promising results. Patients reported feeling more in control of their treatment, more connected to their care teams. Sometimes, late at night when I'm reviewing grant applications or budget reports, I find myself talking to him. Not in any mystical sense, but in the way you talk to someone whose voice you carry with you. I tell him about the students we've helped, the families we've supported, the small victories that add up to something larger. I tell him that his choice to trust me with his legacy was the greatest honor of my life. That every decision I make for the foundation is filtered through a simple question. What would David want? Not the David who was weakened by illness, not the David who was angry at Isabella's betrayal, but the David who believed that technology should serve humanity, that resources should be shared, that dignity should be preserved even in the hardest moments. The Foundation's first annual report was published last week. 47 pages documenting our impact, our financials, our plans for the future. On the dedication page, I included a quote from one of his final emails. If we can make even one person's difficult journey a little easier, then everything we've built will have been worth it. Isabella Reeves is not mentioned anywhere in those pages. Not because I wanted to erase her, but because she was never part of the story that mattered. The story that mattered was about love that stays, about strength that endures, about choosing purpose over profit, presence over performance. That story continues. Every scholarship awarded, every family supported, every innovation funded is another chapter in David's real legacy. Not the inheritance Isabella tried to claim, but the inheritance he actually left. A commitment to making the world a little better, one careful decision at a time. Margaret Chen, that's who I am. Not the grieving mother, not the protective guardian, not the woman who stood up to a lie. I am the person David chose to carry his vision forward. And every day I choose to be worthy of that trust.